George.Camden UNISON and the chair of the local trades council. I'd like to say, first of all, that we can see for ourselves tonight that the numbers here are a bit discouraging. People can't hear me? People can hear me now, certainly, I trust. The numbers tonight are perhaps discouraging, and they are not up to the task that we face locally at this point in time. And we do, I think, recognise that we have lost momentum since the 30th of November 2011, when we saw the closest thing Britain has seen to a general strike since 1926. Between 1.5 and 2 million public sector workers taking strike action. And we have to be blunt that a number of trade union leaders, and I think Hector pointed to it in his contribution, squandered the momentum that built up to the 30th of November, and in my view at least, and I'm sure this view is shared by most people in the room, could have sustained us through much more struggle in 2012 than we've witnessed so far. But turning to the local situation, it's unfortunate Jaola, who has been a leading figure in the battle by the traffic wardens employed by NSL, has had to go. But I did want to say a couple of things that are quite specific and concrete about their fight. It looks very likely that the workplace ballot that concludes tomorrow will return an overwhelming yes vote to an indefinite strike. Now, it's our task in Camden Unison to ensure that the will of those members is translated into further strike action, and if they voted for it, let's make sure it's all out indefinite. And I do think it is actually worth seeking to mobilise the whole of the trade union movement in this borough behind their struggle. Because Hugo referred to policies earlier adopted in this council chamber. Well, one of those policies was actually the London living wage on outsourced contracts. But, and this is but, capital B, capital U, capital T, that does not apply to existing privatised contracts. In fact, for most of the workers who are making, in many cases, substantially below £8.30 an hour, it's irrelevant until after the current Labour administration's term of office has expired in May 2014. And that includes the contract with NSL, which is due to run until 2016. Because one of the crimes that was perpetrated under the last Labour government was the acceleration of the privatisation of public services. And council taxpayers have actually been subsidising the profits of multinational companies like ISS and Veolia locally, and national firms like NSL over the past decade or more. And in fact, we've also been subsidising through the benefit system the reality of poverty pay. Poverty pay, which is now all too often the norm for workers, whether in the private or the public sector in this country. I'm not going to depress people by rehearsing the figures about the extent of the erosion of real pay in local government. Max has pointed to the reality in terms of higher education in this country. Hector's pointed to the reality in terms of the civil service in Britain. But it is a situation where there has already been a massive transfer of wealth from the wealthiest to the wealthiest from some of the poorest sections of society. I'll wind up by pointing to Jeremy's speech, which I thought was extremely uplifting. Because we may feel downhearted after the loss of momentum that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. But in Quebec, it would have been, in my view, one of the least likely places to see such a sustained and massive struggle erupt in the Western world. And I say that because if you look at Canada as a whole, of which Quebec, reluctantly or otherwise, is still a part, it returned an extremely right-wing Tory government. Stephen Harper, in many ways, is a more vile figure publicly than David Cameron, if you can imagine that. He is, an adamant supporter of Bush, Romney, etc. Returned nationally with a thumping majority at the last federal elections in Canada. In Quebec, a neoliberal government led by George.Camden of the so-called Liberal Party, very very similar in many ways to Nick Clegg's Lib Dems. And the Parti Québécois, a nationalist organisation, not a traditional Labour Social Democratic party. And yet that movement, actually, against an unpromising background, was sustained for months, forged links with organised workers, and contributed to the defeat of the Charest government at the provincial elections in September, and actually forced the Parti Québécois to run on the platform of stopping those tuition hikes and effectively repealing, I believe it's called Law 12 or the Bill 78, one of the most draconian attacks on civil liberties, on the right to protest witnessed in North America in our lifetimes. So I think we should draw inspiration from across the Atlantic as well as from the struggles in the Mediterranean countries within the European Union over the coming weeks and months. The immediate task, obviously, as Candy pointed out quite rightly, to ensure that from this borough we achieve a turnout of thousands on the 20th of October, ensuring that it becomes the springboard for much more militant, much more sustained resistance than we've seen thus far to what really is a fundamental attack on all the achievements of the post-war period in this country. Thank you, and sorry for going on for too long.